Korean nationalism.
In this lecture, we will examine nationalism and how nationalism has played a very important role in modern Korea. We're going to examine this from a historical perspective and in comparison with other types of nationalism so that we can understand the unique nature of Korean nationalism. So first we will begin with comparisons with the formation of Chinese nationalism and Japanese nationalism in the 19th century. Our main content, though, will focus on the development of Korean nationalism at the end of the 19th century, first as an attempt to redefine what it meant to be Korean and Korea itself, and later as part of the March 1st and other independence movements. Finally, we will discuss how the fractured nature of nationalism during the colonial period led to major political and ideological differences that influenced post-liberation Korea.
Introduction. Self-strengthening movement in the late 19th century. March 1st movement and independence movements abroad. The Cold War and Korean nationalism. Contemporary Korean nationalism. Conclusion. Introduction.
First, to understand the definition of nationalism and compare its formation and historical context in different countries, we have to understand where the term nationalism comes from. Because nationalism is in fact a modern phenomenon, and the rise of the nation state is a modern phenomenon. We will not in this lecture discuss questions about which came first, the nation or nationalism, but we will look at the historical rise of the nation state and its connection to nationalism.
What is an empire and what constitutes an empire?
By looking at the historical context, nationalism actually first arose as a result of the effects of Western imperialism on China and Japan. So before this time in the traditional period, in Qing China and in Tokugawa or Meiji Japan, these were the first countries in East Asia to experience Western imperialism firsthand. And as a result of this, they began to confront what exactly did it mean to be Chinese and how do we define what the Chinese nation or the Japanese nation was. This was a time period also where, because Western imperialist powers were entering into the area and being quite aggressive, the different countries were carving up China, as we have examined in previous lectures, and they were making inroads and establishing spheres of influence in China. And China being an extremely large country, being multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural, it up until this point had not really had to really seriously consider questions about what it meant to be Chinese until this time period, and when it was a time when China was beginning to form its own nation state. So as the Western imperialist powers came to East Asia, they looked to China because China was a prosperous country, and they felt that it was a huge market and would be optimal for trade. So the British first began to trade with China, and because there were a lot of things that the British actually wanted from the Chinese, they wanted silk and porcelain and tea, there was a trade imbalance between the two countries. So to rectify this imbalance, or to reverse the balance, Britain began to illegally import opium into China. And this did, in fact, reverse the balance. And the Chinese authorities, they obviously didn't want opium in the country, and so they started to crack down on this. And once they did crack down on it, this then led to the First Opium War from 1839 to 1842, which the British won because of superior firepower. And then it also led to a second Opium War from 1856 to about 1860. Now, not only were the Chinese being harassed by the British, but they were also being, their northern territories were being encroached upon by the Russians. This again occurred in the late 19th century. And then also, China had come into conflict with the French in 1883 to 1885, and then had also come into conflict with the Japanese on the Korean Peninsula in 1894 to 1895. So the 19th century was not a great century for the Qing dynasty, and they experienced quite a bit of hardship as a result. In order to understand a little bit more about how this process took place, how Western imperialist powers increased their entrenchment and interference in China and caused all kinds of problems for the Qing dynasty, let's take a look at this video. So at some point, the Qing dynasty wanted to reform and wanted to start to try to create a Chinese national state or nation state that could then be an entity that interacted on par with other Western countries. China had previously tried to borrow from the West and to increase its wealth and power through a variety of means. For example, they tried to import or develop their military technology. They tried to ramp up their economic institutions, and they started developing science and scholarship and modern education. And they also did make some reforms in terms of the government and political processes. But unfortunately, these were not enough. So by the time we enter into the 20th century, what we see happening in China is what some historians refer to as frustrated nationalism. So there was a sense that China, they were proud of its history and its heritage, but were frustrated with the fact that it was constantly being defeated by other countries, losing territories, losing in conflicts, and that something needed to be done in order to strengthen China. We see a similar phenomenon in Meiji, similar in the way that at the end of the Tokugawa period, Japan was also confronted with Western imperial powers, forced to change certain aspects and to reform, and to reconsider what it meant to be a modern Japanese nation state. In 1867, the Tokugawa shogun stepped down from power, and the young emperor was then restored to power. And so this is called the Meiji Restoration. And the emperor felt that the best way to counter Western influence, because Japan had seen the military power of these Western imperialist countries, he felt that the best way for Japan was to modernize, industrialize, and to militarize. And so this began the Meiji era, or the era of enlightened rule. Japan, historically having a tradition of military governments and valuing military power, it is not surprising then that the Japanese took to Western military technology and was able to adapt it quite quickly. So after they had been opened up by the American Commodore Perry in approximately 1953, they started quickly to modernize, to adopt Western military technology, and to really focus on developing their military. And as their military grew and as their military became increasingly more powerful and successful, so did Japan's feelings of nationalism grow. And Japan also began to look at Europe and to see the empires that European nations had built and felt that they needed to build their own empire as well. At some point, Japan had made inroads into Korea and had forced Korea to open up its country to trade to them in 1876. But after a certain amount of time and coming into conflict with the Chinese, this came to a head in 1894 with the Sino-Japanese War. Although China was a much larger country and historically more powerful than Japan, Japan, through the Sino-Japanese War, was able to test out their newly acquired military technology and new and improved weaponry. And it turned out that this new and improved army and military was superior to the Chinese. So they were able to defeat the Chinese and remove China as its competitor. So, although the Sino-Japanese War was fought between Japan and China for trading rights, what this did was it removed China as the main influence or the primary influencer in Korea, and it also helped Japan to start to gain a foothold in Manchuria. In order to get a sense of what the conflict was like between the Chinese and the Japanese during this war, let's take a look at this video. So Japan in 1895 successfully drove China out of Korea, was able to destroy the Chinese Navy, and also gain a foothold into Manchuria, which is rich in natural resources. 10 years later, the Japanese went to war with the Russians. Now, the Russians had historically had an interest in Korea, and as they had further encroached southward into the Korean Peninsula, established a port at, or opened a port at Yeongnam-po, the Japanese felt increasingly more worried and anxious about Russian influence in Korea and decided that they needed to be removed as a competitor as well. So Japan launched a surprise attack against Russia in 1904, and they were able to take over Port Arthur, which was a strategic port for the Russian military. As a result of this, the Russians had to go all the way around the other way, and the Russian Navy had to go down and around Africa and back up again in order to get supplies to the battle lines during this war. And once they reached into the waters around Temado or Tsushima, the Japanese Navy was waiting for the Russians. And so this is actually very well documented by the Japanese, where you have the Japanese soldiers fighting against and defeating Russian soldiers. And then as we move into the 20th century and the First World War and the Second World War, we can see through this map that Japan expands its empire, and this only fuels their sense of nationalism and pride in their country even more. However, during poor economic times as a result of the Great Depression, many Japanese began to blame the government. And so it's at this moment that military leaders were able to take advantage of the situation and reassert their power. And so they began to control the emperor behind the scenes, and as the empire grew, so did Japanese nationalism. So if we look at the definition of nationalism itself, it is often defined as a devotion to the interests or culture of one's nation. So rather than being inclusive, and rather than being looking at greater areas or greater civilizations, this definition and this concept is much more specific. Nationalism is also defined as a belief that nations will benefit acting independently rather than collectively or in cooperation with each other. And so the emphasis is on national goals rather than international or regional goals. This definition also includes aspirations for national independence in a country under foreign domination. So we see nationalism and nationalist sentiment in colonial territories where they are being dominated by another, but they are attempting to restore their national sovereignty.
These are the keywords for this class: imperialism, modernization, industrialization, military expansion.